The street always looked the same at first glance. Neatly trimmed lawns, rows of beige houses, mailboxes standing like soldiers at the end of each driveway. It was the kind of neighborhood people drove through and thought, nothing bad could ever happen here. The sidewalks were always swept clean, kids' bikes lay tipped over in the grass, and you could almost smell the fresh paint clinging to the stucco walls. It was quiet, almost unnervingly so, the kind of silence that made every sound stand out sharper. The whir of sprinklers, the bark of a dog 3 houses down, the faint slam of a car door. On the surface, it was a picture of order. But order has a way of hiding cracks beneath its polished surface. The HOA ruled over the community like a shadow government, invisible yet everywhere. They decided the length of your grass, the shade of beige you painted your shutters, even the color of your front door. People joked about it, but the laughter always had an edge to it. No one wanted to admit how much power a handful of neighbors could hold over everyone else. Most people followed the rules, partly out of habit, partly out of fear. The letters slipped under doors weren't just reminders, they were warnings. And sometimes, warnings were followed by visits. It was late summer, the air heavy with heat that didn't let up even after the sun had dipped behind the houses. The streetlights glowed a soft orange, and moths spun circles beneath them. Inside the houses, families gathered for dinner, air conditioners hummed, and televisions flickered with the evening news. It was a place that prided itself on safety, where people left their blinds half open as if to say, "See? Nothing to hide here. That illusion would not last." The people involved looked ordinary enough. A middle-aged couple with a teenager trying to stretch her independence without snapping the leash. A retired man who spent more time in his garage than inside the house. A woman who ran the neighborhood Facebook group with an iron fist, watching every post as if it were a personal threat. And then there was me, a name unknown to most of them, blending in as just another homeowner who waved at the right times, parked in the right place, and never left trash cans out too long. They saw only what I allowed them to see. The truth was, I was more than I seemed. My job required silence, patience, and a constant mask that fit snugly over who I really was. To them, I was just another neighbor, but I carried something far heavier than lawn duties and HOA dues. The Bureau trained me to listen, to watch, to sense when something didn't add up. And even before that night, something about this neighborhood carried an undertone, like a song slightly off-key. Some of the people who walked these sidewalks were already at war with themselves. The mother who smiled in the driveway but cried inside the bathroom with the fan on. The father who obeyed the HOA rules but cursed them when no one could hear. The kids who overheard too much but knew better than to repeat it. Everyone played their part in keeping the neighborhood picture perfect, but perfection is fragile. It only takes one person pulling the wrong thread for everything to unravel. The first hint of trouble came in small ways. A man parked a little too close to another's driveway, and the argument lasted longer than it should have. A woman complained about weeds creeping up along a fence, her tone sharper than necessary. Little disputes grew heavier, carrying more venom than seemed natural for something so minor. It was as if the rules weren't just about grass or paint or noise anymore. They had become weapons, a way to control and humiliate. I noticed it in the way people's eyes lingered too long, in the hushed conversations that stopped when someone else walked by. There was an air of surveillance, a sense that privacy didn't exist here. Not really. For some, that was just part of living in a tight-knit community. For others, it was suffocating. And then some saw it as an opportunity. It started with uniforms that looked official at a glance, voices that carried authority, and the confidence of people who believed no one would dare question them. Neighbors had already grown used to control, so when it came dressed as law and order, they didn't blink. That trust, blind, quiet, and easy, was the perfect weapon. Before the night it happened, I had the same thought running through my mind. How thin the line was between order and tyranny. I had seen it before, in places far away, where men pretended to be more powerful than they were, and others followed out of fear. I never expected to see it on my own street, under the same glow of the streetlights where children once played. The story of what happened here doesn't start with violence. It begins with power, quiet, creeping, disguised as something familiar. A false sense of safety, smiles hiding threats, neighbors watching neighbors. And beneath it all, the slow, steady build of something ready to snap. It started small, as these things often do. A notice slipped into a mailbox, folded neatly, typed, in a tone that pretended to be polite but dripped with authority. Your garbage bins were left on the street past HOA approved hours. Signed only, Community Compliance Officer. Most neighbors would sigh, roll their eyes, and shove it into the drawer where all HOA letters went to die. But something about this one was different. It wasn't on official letterhead. The paper was thinner, the wording harsher, almost threatening. Still, nobody wanted to push back. That's how it always went. Rules first, pride second. Then came the uniforms. 2 men, not quite police but close enough to make your stomach clench when they appeared at the end of the driveway. Black tactical boots, cargo pants, dark shirts with patches that looked official, if you didn't stare too long. They had the tone of authority down perfectly. Calm, clipped, not asking, but commanding. They started making rounds, knocking on doors, handing out citations for everything from weeds in flower beds to cars parked the wrong way. Neighbors whispered about it in private, but no one dared say it out loud. Who questions the law when it comes to wearing a badge, even if that badge isn't real? I watched it build like a storm cloud. The tension wasn't sudden. It spread slowly, pulling at people's nerves until they were raw. A retired man named Harris had been one of the first targets. His truck, old but reliable, had oil spots beneath it on the driveway. One of the fake officers stood on his porch for nearly an hour, lecturing him as if he were a criminal. Harris's face flushed red as he argued back, voice trembling with age and anger. But he paid the fine anyway. He muttered about it for weeks after, bitterness curling in his words. But his anger had nowhere to go. That helplessness was the first crack. Others weren't as passive. A woman named Denise, who already lorded over the HOA Facebook group, seemed to thrive under the new order. She started snapping pictures of her neighbors' houses, tagging infractions, encouraging the so-called officers to pay them visits. Her power grew alongside theirs, feeding off it, almost gleeful. For her, this wasn't just about neat lawns. It was about control, about bending people to her will. She had always loved the spotlight, but now she wielded fear as a weapon, and no one dared challenge her. The fear wasn't just about the fines. It was about what might come next. Rumors spread that these officers had the authority to report violations to the police, that unpaid fees could lead to court summons or even arrests. The lines blurred between rumor and truth. Some believed it, others doubted, but doubt itself was poison. It ate away at trust. And in a neighborhood built on appearances, trust was everything. Behind closed doors, lives were unraveling. Harris's savings were thin, and each fake fine dug deeper into his already fragile budget. He started skipping meals, his pride refusing to let him ask for help. Denise, drunk on her newfound influence, pushed her own husband into silence whenever he questioned her obsession. Their arguments echoed through the thin walls, sharp and bitter. Across the street, a young couple fought constantly about whether to sell the house and escape or stay and fight. The husband felt trapped, furious at being pushed around. His wife begged him to stay quiet, afraid of retaliation. Fear turned into resentment, and resentment into rage. It was around this time that I started to notice eyes on me more often. At first I thought it was paranoia, but then I caught one of them, one of the fake officers, leaning against a patrol car that wasn't quite regulation. He stared at my house, his posture casual, but his eyes sharp. He wanted me to see him. It wasn't about enforcing a rule, it was about marking territory. The deeper I looked, the clearer it became. These men weren't just opportunists. They weren't bored neighbors playing dress-up. They had an agenda. Their background checks, once I dug into them, revealed small-time scams, failed businesses, and debts hanging over their heads. They weren't here to keep order. They were here to build a system of fear, and fear was profitable. But the neighborhood didn't know that. To them, the fake officers became a constant presence, something like shadows that slipped in and out of sight. They showed up at odd hours, shining flashlights into backyards, claiming they were looking for suspicious activity. They questioned teenagers walking home, demanding IDs. Parents whispered about it, children started avoiding the streets, but no one dared to challenge them openly. The fake authority had worked its way into everyone's mind. The tension reached its boiling point at a block meeting. Denise had called it, of course, demanding everyone attend. The officers stood at the back like bodyguards, their arms crossed, eyes scanning the crowd. Denise spoke with that smug smile of hers, going on about community standards and keeping order. But the room was restless. People shifted in their seats, muttering. Harris finally stood, voice shaking but loud. "They're not real cops," he said. "They're frauds." The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. Everyone looked at the officers, waiting for them to react. And they did. One of them stepped forward, close enough that Harris flinched. He didn't say much, just leaned down and murmured something in Harris's ear. Whatever it was made Harris pale. He sat down without another word. No one else dared speak up after that. The meeting ended quickly, tension buzzing like electricity. The message was clear. Opposition would not be tolerated. That night, I lay awake, listening to the sounds of the neighborhood. A dog barked once, then went quiet. A car engine idled too long before pulling away. Somewhere, a woman's voice rose in anger, then cut off. It was all normal, and yet not. The air itself felt heavy, like the pause before thunder. Secrets began spilling out in ways no one expected. Harris, drinking one night in his garage, confessed to me about his debt, about how the fake officers had threatened to report him for unpaid dues he didn't even owe. Denise's husband, cornered at the grocery store, admitted he was terrified of what his wife was involved in, but couldn't stop her. And the young couple? Their fights grew louder, angrier, until one night the wife left with her bags, swearing she'd never come back. It wasn't just about rules anymore. It was about control, dominance, the intoxicating mix of power and fear. Neighbors started spying on each other, desperate to avoid being the next target. Some even turned to the fake officers willingly, offering information, pointing fingers, hoping to protect themselves. Paranoia spread like fire. Inside me, a different kind of tension built. My training told me to wait, to watch, to gather enough evidence before acting. But my instincts screamed that something was about to snap. The fake officers were pushing harder, growing bolder. And the people, already stretched thin by money problems, broken marriages, hidden addictions, were reaching their limits. When fragile lives are pushed too far, they break. And broken people don't always break quietly. What made it worse was the way these men enjoyed it. I could see it in their smirks, the way they lingered too long after delivering fines, the way they leaned close when people tried to argue, letting silence do the work of intimidation. They weren't just exploiting power, they were addicted to it, and addiction always demands more. By the end of that summer, the neighborhood no longer felt like home. Windows stayed closed, doors locked earlier, and people avoided eye contact on the street. The once lively sidewalks were empty. Fear had rooted itself deep, twisting normal lives into something darker. Everyone felt it, even if they didn't say it. Something was coming. Something had to give. The night it happened was thick with heat, the kind that clung to your skin and made the air feel heavy. Streetlights buzzed against the stillness, casting their orange glow across empty driveways. Curtains were drawn, blinds snapped shut, and the neighborhood looked like it had gone to sleep. But behind those walls, no one was really sleeping anymore. Fear had made insomniacs of us all. I had been sitting in the living room, lights off, watching shadows move across the street. Something in the air felt wrong. The kind of wrong that you can't quite name but that your body recognizes instantly. It was too quiet, too still. Even the cicadas had gone silent. And then I saw them. The two fake officers walking in step, their boots loud against the pavement. They weren't making rounds this time. Their movements were deliberate, their posture sharp. They stopped at Harris's house. Harris had been unraveling for weeks. I knew he was close to breaking, his debts piling up, his pride in tatters. The officers had been on him harder than anyone else, circling him like vultures. That night, as their fists pounded on his door, I felt the air split with tension. Lights flicked on in a few houses, blinds cracked open, neighbors watching like frightened children. Harris answered. His frame filled the doorway, shoulders hunched but trembling. From across the street, I couldn't hear every word, but I could hear the tone. The officers were demanding, their voices low but edged with cruelty. Harris shouted back, his words slurred with drink and desperation. One of them shoved him, pushing him back inside. That was the moment I stood. My training screamed to intervene, but I wasn't ready to break cover, not yet. I moved closer, my steps silent, heart hammering. Inside, the argument exploded. Furniture scraped against the floor, glass shattered. Harris's voice rose into a roar. Then came the sound, a gunshot, sharp and deafening in the night air. A second later, another. Neighbors screamed, curtains snapped shut. Someone dropped their phone on the pavement, fumbling to dial. My body moved before my mind could catch up. I was already crossing the street, weapon drawn, heart pounding in my ears. When I reached the door, it swung half open, hanging crooked on its hinges. The living room was chaos. Lamps knocked over, papers scattered, blood smeared across the tile. Harris stood there, chest heaving, his face twisted between rage and horror. A pistol shook in his hand. One officer lay sprawled on the carpet, unmoving, a dark pool spreading beneath him. The other was crouched against the wall, clutching his shoulder where blood pulsed between his fingers. Harris's eyes met mine. In that split second, I saw everything. His anger, his fear, the crushing weight of his choices. He wasn't a killer by nature, but desperation had pushed him to the edge, and he had stepped over it. His lips trembled as he tried to speak, but no words came. The gun slipped from his hand, clattering against the tile, and he stumbled back. The wounded officer's eyes burned with fury. He spat blood onto the floor, glaring at Harris as if he had committed the ultimate betrayal. His hand twitched toward his belt, toward another weapon, but I was faster. My voice cut through the chaos, sharp and commanding. "Don't move." He froze, rage still radiating off him, but fear flickered in his eyes when he realized who I was. The badge I flashed wasn't fake. The room was a storm of emotions. Harris collapsed into a chair, hands covering his face, sobs breaking through his chest. The wounded officer cursed, his voice low and venomous, muttering promises of revenge even as his blood soaked the carpet. The dead one lay still, the silence of his body louder than any scream. Outside, neighbors had gathered in clusters, whispers cutting through the night. Some clutched their children, shielding their eyes, while others stared with grim fascination. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder, slicing through the heavy air. I remember the smell most vividly. The metallic tang of blood mixed with the sour stench of sweat and spilled liquor. The acrid smoke of the gun still hung in the room, stinging my nose, burning my throat. Every sense was heightened, every detail etched into memory. The way Harris's hands shook, the sound of his breath breaking, the dark smear of blood on the officer's boot. As the sirens drew closer, Harris looked up at me, eyes red and glassy. "I didn't mean," he whispered, his voice cracked, like a child begging to be believed, but intent no longer mattered. The deed was done. Police cars screeched to a stop outside, their lights painting the houses in flashing red and blue. Doors slammed, voices shouted, feet pounded against the pavement. For the first time, the neighborhood saw real officers step into their street, but they were too late. The crime had already unfolded. The aftermath was chaos. Harris was pulled from his house, his protests drowned out by the commotion. The wounded officer was taken into custody, though not without a fight, his curses echoing long after he was dragged away. The dead man remained on the floor, a stark reminder of how far things had gone. Neighbors scattered, retreating into their homes, locking their doors as if shutting the world out would erase what they had seen. Denise stood at the edge of the crowd, her face pale, her eyes wide. For the first time, she looked powerless. In the silence that followed, after the sirens faded and the crowd dispersed, the street felt different. The illusion was gone. The perfect neighborhood had been shattered by violence, and no amount of paint or manicured lawns could hide the stain. The crime was born out of fear, desperation, and manipulation. It wasn't just a shooting. It was the collapse of everything that had been building in the shadows. And standing there watching the blood dry on the tiles, I knew the hardest part wasn't what had happened that night. It was what would come after. The neighborhood woke up the next morning not to the hum of sprinklers or the bark of dogs, but to silence so thick it seemed to press against the walls. Police tape stretched across Harris's driveway, bright yellow against the pale stucco. The blood had been scrubbed, but the dark stains still clung to the tile, impossible to hide. Neighbors walked more slowly that morning, eyes darting to the house, voices lowered to whispers. No one dared to linger too long. It was as if the entire Reed had been caught doing something shameful, and the shame clung to everyone. Harris was gone, hauled away in the back of a squad car, his face pale, his hands shaking. The image stayed with the neighbors, the sight of a man who once waved at kids, who fixed his own truck on weekends, now sitting behind glass, looking hollow. Some pitied him. Others saw him as proof that violence lived in even the most ordinary homes. And for a few, there was anger. Anger that he had pulled the trigger, that he had crossed the line no one else dared to cross. Inside the jail, Harris barely spoke. He asked for water, then nothing else. His lawyer later said he swung between silence and rambling, between swearing he didn't mean to shoot and muttering that they left him no choice. He replayed that night over and over, as if searching for a version where it ended differently, but there was no undoing it. The gunshot was final. The wounded officer, now stripped of his disguise and laid bare in the public eye, faced a different kind of aftermath. His shoulder was patched in a hospital room under guard, but his fury never left him. He called Harris a coward and swore revenge on anyone who tried to expose him further. The investigation quickly uncovered the scam, the fake badges, the phony citations, the cash that never made it into any official account. What had once seemed so official now looked pathetic under the light. Old debts and arrest records resurfaced. The illusion of power crumbled. But with the illusion gone, something uglier replaced it. Resentment, humiliation, a man cornered by his own lies. Denise found herself at the center of whispers. She had aligned herself so closely with the fake officers, backed their authority, and encouraged their control. Now, neighbors looked at her with suspicion. Her once tight grip on the Facebook group slipped. Posts went unanswered, her comments ignored. For a woman who had built her identity on control, the sudden silence was devastating. Her husband barely spoke to her, tired of the drama that had consumed their marriage. She wasn't charged, but she didn't need to be. The community turned its back on her, and for someone like Denise, that was its own kind of prison. The families around the block struggled to explain what had happened. Children asked questions that parents didn't know how to answer. Why did Mr. Harris shoot them? Weren't they police? Parents stumbled through half-truths, trying to protect innocence already cracked. Some packed up and left within weeks, unable to shake the unease. Others stayed but changed. Blinds closed tighter, conversations clipped, the warmth of the neighborhood gone. For me, the aftermath was both professional and personal. The Bureau moved quickly, stepping in to take over the case. Reports, depositions, endless questions. My cover was gone, my role in the neighborhood exposed. Some looked at me with gratitude, others with betrayal. They wondered why I hadn't acted sooner, why I had let things spiral to the point of bloodshed. The truth, that I needed evidence, that timing mattered, did little to ease their anger. For them, the line between protector and bystander blurred. Media coverage poured in, of course. Headlines screamed about fake cops terrorize suburb and neighborhood vigilante shooting. Harris was painted in two lights. One, a desperate man pushed too far by scammers. The other, a violent neighbor who turned his rage into murder. The officers were dragged through their criminal history, every scam and fraud laid bare. Denise's name surfaced too, tied to their little empire of control. The neighborhood itself became a symbol, a cautionary tale about how power, when unchecked, can poison even the quietest of streets. But what the cameras couldn't capture was the weight left behind. The guilt sat in Harris's chest as he replayed that moment. The denial clung to the wounded officer, insisting he had been in the right, even as the world saw through him. The silence between Denise and her husband was growing heavier with each passing day. The fear in the children's eyes when they saw uniforms, real or fake, and didn't know which to trust. At night, the street was darker. Fewer porch lights, fewer neighbors chatting on lawns. The trust that once bound them had been shattered. They had all been complicit in a way, turning their heads, staying quiet, obeying out of fear. And now, that silence felt like betrayal. Harris's trial dragged on for months. His lawyer argued self-defense, that he believed his life was at risk. Prosecutors painted him as unstable, reckless. The truth was messier, sitting somewhere in between. For Harris, every word in that courtroom was a reminder of what he had lost. His freedom, his reputation, the quiet dignity of being just another man on the block. The community never fully healed. Houses changed owners, new families moved in, but the memory lingered like a stain. The story spread, whispered beyond the neighborhood, a warning of how fast ordinary life can collapse when fear is allowed to rule. And for those who had lived through it, the aftermath was not measured in headlines or verdicts, but in the way they carried themselves, hesitant, cautious, shadows in their eyes. The crime had not just taken a life, it had taken the illusion of safety, and once lost, that never truly returns. Harris's trial ended the way most people expected, but not without leaving behind fractures that could never be mended. He was convicted of manslaughter, not murder. A recognition that the men he shot were frauds, that the circumstances pushed him to a breaking point. Still, the years he was sentenced to were long enough that he would never again return to his quiet life on that street. When the verdict was read, he lowered his head, not in defiance, but in resignation. It was as if he had already accepted the outcome long before the jury made its decision. The moment he pulled the trigger, his old life had ended. The man who tinkered with his truck, who waved at kids riding their bikes, no longer existed. What remained was a shell carrying guilt, fear, and the bitter knowledge that no one had come to help him until it was too late. The surviving officer faced his own reckoning. With the scam laid bare, he could no longer hide behind his uniform or his false authority. The court charged him with impersonating law enforcement, fraud, extortion, and conspiracy. His bravado carried him only so far. The moment he was confronted with evidence, photographs of fake badges, financial records of stolen fines, testimony from neighbors, his mask cracked. He sat there, smirking at first, then slowly unraveling as the system he tried to exploit turned on him. His sentence was long, but prison was not the harshest punishment. What truly destroyed him was the humiliation, the public exposure of a man who once thrived on fear, reduced to nothing more than another inmate in a jumpsuit. Denise was never charged, but her punishment was social exile. The neighbors she once dominated cut her off entirely. Her Facebook group withered, her influence dissolved, and she found herself isolated in the very community she had tried to control. Her husband eventually left, unable to stomach the life he had built on manipulation and fear. For someone who had spent years feeding on power, the silence that followed was unbearable. She was not behind bars, but in many ways, she lived in a prison of her own making. As for the neighborhood, it never truly returned to what it had been. Families who stayed carried the memory of fear in every glance, in every hesitant wave to a new neighbor. For years, the house where it happened remained a symbol, a reminder that violence could creep into even the neatest rows of suburban lawns. Some tried to paint over it, to pretend it was just an isolated tragedy, but deep down, everyone knew it was more than that. It was proof that silence and obedience could create the perfect breeding ground for abuse. The illusion of safety had been shattered, and once lost, it could never fully be rebuilt. From a wider lens, the case rippled outward, picked up by media outlets, debated in town halls, and written about in op-eds. People argued about whether Harris was a victim of manipulation or simply a man too weak to handle his problems. Lawmakers spoke about strengthening penalties for impersonating officers, about closing the legal gaps that let people like these men exploit authority. The story became a warning, a headline used to caution others. Always question authority. Always look closer. But beneath the legal arguments and the headlines lay something deeper, something less easy to legislate. This wasn't just about two con men in fake uniforms or a desperate man with a gun. It was about the fragile balance of power in human relationships, about how quickly control can twist into abuse, how easily fear can become a currency, and how silence, whether out of fear or convenience, can enable cruelty to thrive. Justice, in its legal form, was served. Harris paid for the lives he took. The surviving officer paid for the lies he spun. Denise paid for the greed she fed. Yet none of it felt clean. There were no winners here. Only people are broken in different ways. Harris's prison sentence couldn't erase the years of torment he endured. The officer's conviction couldn't undo the nights neighbors spent terrified in their own homes. And Denise's exile couldn't repair the marriages, friendships, and trust that had been destroyed. What lingered most was the question of morality. Where was the line between survival and crime, between obedience and complicity, between control and cruelty? Harris believed he had no choice, that he had been pushed into a corner where violence was the only way out. But choices always exist, even if they are impossible ones. His choice left blood on the floor, and nothing, not even the truth of the officer's fraud, could wash that away. Looking back, the story was not about a single night or a single crime. It was about the slow, creeping erosion of trust. It was about how power, when left unchecked, corrodes everything it touches. The fake officers did not just exploit rules, they exploited human fear. They counted on people being too afraid, too uncertain, too obedient to fight back. And for a time, they were right. In the end, what broke that silence was not courage, not community, but desperation. Harris snapped under the weight of fear and humiliation, and when he did, he shattered the fragile structure the scammers had built. His act was violent, tragic, and irreversible, but it pulled the masks off everyone. The officers were exposed. Denise was revealed. The neighborhood was forced to see itself clearly for the first time. The broader lesson was unsettling. Evil doesn't always arrive with chaos and noise. Sometimes it slips in quietly, disguised as order, wrapped in rules, wearing a uniform that looks just real enough. And sometimes the people who enforce that false order are not strangers, but neighbors, friends, even the ones who smile at you across the street. Justice may have closed the case, but the story lived on as a reminder. That safety built on silence is fragile. That power without accountability is dangerous. And that is when people surrender their voices out of fear. They open the door to tyranny, whether it wears a crown, a badge, or just a smug smile behind a neighborhood rulebook. The lives of everyone involved were changed forever. Harris would live out his days marked by guilt and regret. The officer would rot behind bars, stripped of the authority he once craved. Denise would fade into the background, a ghost in the community she once ruled. And the neighborhood, once a picture of quiet perfection, would forever carry the shadow of what happened there. In the end, this was not just the story of a crime, but the story of human nature, the hunger for control, the weight of fear, the choices people make when pushed too far. It was about how thin the line is between order and oppression, and how fragile the veneer of safety truly is. And maybe above all, it was about the cost of silence and how much blood it takes to finally break it.